Most people picture that sentence as a simple moral warning, a reminder for men to watch where their eyes wander on the street. The truth is something else entirely. What Jesus actually declared that morning, on a hillside in Galilee, demanded a complete reframing of the concept of sin, the concept of the mind, and the concept of human responsibility. This is the story no one told you. Put yourself in the position of the people listening. Seated on a hillside north of the Sea of Galilee, around 5,000 people had gathered to hear a carpenter from Nazareth barely past 30 years old. That number was equivalent to the crowd inside a small university gymnasium, all pressed together on a single sun-exposed slope. Among those present were weathered fishermen, women holding children in their arms, Pharisees in ritual robes, Roman soldiers keeping quiet watch, and beggars who had walked dozens of miles under the blazing Palestinian sun. The sermon lasted several hours, and at a certain moment he said something that dropped the entire hillside into silence. "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman with desire has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Matthew chapter 5 verses 27 and 28. 11 words in the original Greek, and a shockwave that would travel across 20 centuries. Consider what those words meant to the people hearing them. For a first-century Jew, adultery was a capital offense under Leviticus chapter 20 verse 10. Maximum penalty. Public stoning. The physical act was the clear boundary between faithfulness and betrayal, between life and execution. And here was this man claiming that the boundary was not in the act, it was in the gaze, it was in the sustained thought, it was in the internal movement of desire before a single outward gesture had been made. Now measure the impact of that on the religious system of the day. The temple in Jerusalem operated on a flawless structure of quantifiable commandments. You observed 613 commandments of the Torah. You counted your steps on the Sabbath so as not to exceed the limit of roughly 900 meters, about 10 city blocks by modern measure. You measured the distance between the fringes on your cloak. Everything was external, observable, countable. The Pharisees had spent 4 centuries constructing what they called a fence around the law, layer upon layer of regulations to prevent even the approach of sin. And that sentence pulverized the entire structure. No one could consider themselves righteous simply because they had never committed physical adultery. No one could measure themselves against a neighbor using the standard of visible action. The law had become a mirror that reflected the interior, and no one came away clean from what it showed. Silence. And that was precisely what Jesus intended to provoke. Look closely at the Greek term used in the original. The word is epithymio. It does not simply mean noticing a woman on the street. It does not describe the automatic initial attraction any human being experiences. The Greek verb carries the sense of deliberate coveting, of cultivating desire, of feeding it internally until it becomes a sustained intention. It is the same root used in the 10th commandment when the text says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's wife," in Exodus chapter 20 verse 17. It is not the passing glance. It is the gaze that lingers. It is desire that extends and builds inside the chest like a current gaining volume as a river moves downstream. That changes the entire weight of the sentence. This was not a condemnation of biological humanity. It was the identification of the exact point where thought becomes choice, where impulse transforms into a deliberate internal act. And there, according to Jesus, adultery already exists. Follow the rabbinic landscape of that precise historical moment. In the 1st century of the Common Era, 2 great rabbis dominated the religious thought of Judea, Hillel the Elder and his more conservative rival Shammai. The schools of both men contested the interpretation of the law on nearly every practical point, and their debates sometimes stretched across entire decades before reaching any synthesis. There was a specific ongoing dispute about mental adultery. The school of Shammai held that impure thought had to be fought with extreme rigor, prolonged fasting, and ritualistic self-flagellation. The school of Hillel took a more flexible position, accepting that involuntary thought did not constitute sin if it was not accompanied by action. And Jesus, that morning, went beyond both schools. More radical than Shammai, more penetrating than Hillel, he located sin in the precise instant of internal decision. Not before, not after, in the second when the will adheres to desire. Calculate what this means when placed alongside what already existed in the Hebrew Scriptures. In Job chapter 31, verse 1, the patriarch declares, "I made a covenant with my eyes not to look with desire at a young woman." That text, dated by scholars as composed around the 6th century before Christ, already carried the idea that guarding the gaze is a spiritual discipline. Proverbs chapter 6, verse 25 says, "Do not desire her beauty in your heart." The notion was not entirely new, but Jesus elevated it to the status of absolute equivalence with the consummated act. And that elevation had no precedent in the religious literature of the ancient world. Think about the Hebrew concept of heart. In biblical Hebrew, the word is lev. It does not correspond to the modern emotional heart. In ancient Hebrew thought, the lev is the center of will, of decision, of practical intelligence. When the text says the adulterer exists in the heart, it is not speaking of a passing feeling. It is speaking of the core where every human choice is born. That is where sin forms, before a single muscle in the body moves. But there is still something to reveal. What Jesus said in the very next sentence, Matthew chapter 5, verses 29 and 30, "If your right eye causes you to stumble, tear it out and throw it away from you. If your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away from you." The language is violent, deliberately shocking, and the crowd felt the impact. Notice the care with which those words were chosen. First-century Jewish commentators, recorded in the texts of the Babylonian Talmud compiled centuries later, identified that kind of speech as a form of rabbinic hyperbole. The device was recognized. The intent was not literal. None of the disciples went blind or lost a hand after the sermon. The purpose was to force the listener to grasp the gravity of the situation. If mental sin carries the same weight as physical sin, then interior vigilance must be more radical than any exterior discipline ever practiced. And that is only the beginning of what that sentence implied. Consider the broader cultural landscape. First-century Palestine had lived under Roman occupation for nearly a century. Around 63 years before Christ, the general Pompey had taken Jerusalem. Since then, Roman culture had been seeping into Hellenized cities like Sepphoris, Tiberias, and Caesarea Maritima. And Roman morality operated on an entirely different standard. For the upper-class Roman citizen, adultery was regulated by the Lex Julia de Adulteriis Coascendis, enacted by Augustus around 18 years before Christ. The law punished only the physical act, and even then with variable penalties depending on the social status of those involved. Mental desire held no place whatsoever in the Roman legal framework. Slaves were treated as sexual objects without rights. Public baths mixed bodies in situations that Jewish morality considered abomination. And against that vast cultural backdrop, comparable in scope to the ocean that encircled the entire empire, a carpenter from Galilee declared that sustained thought was already a consummated act. The sentence challenged the Jewish religious system and the Roman cultural system simultaneously. On the surface, it appeared to be another ethical demand among many. Beneath the surface, it was a demolition of the very idea of religious self-justification, And that double collision is part of the reason that sermon has crossed the ages. Witness what this new ethic meant for the first followers. The writings of the Apostolic Fathers, composed between 90 and 150 years into the Common Era, describe Christian communities that practiced systematic fasting, nightly vigils, and severe disciplines to confront what they called sins of thought. This was not morbid asceticism, it was the practical consequence of taking seriously those 11 words spoken in Galilee. Tertullian, writing in Carthage around 200 years into the Common Era, devoted an entire treatise to the problem of interior chastity. Chrysostom, in Antioch in the 4th century, preached complete homilies, analyzing each word of Matthew chapter 5, verse 28. Augustine of Hippo, in the 5th century, wrote in the Confessions that for years he was tormented by the awareness that desire persisted even after the act had ceased. The sentence of Jesus created a tradition of psychological self-examination that had no parallel in the ancient world. Years. That is what entire thinkers spent, entire individual lives, attempting to come to terms with those 11 words. Measure the mental challenge that sentence imposed on 15 centuries of Christendom. The monasteries of the Egyptian desert, founded from the 4th century of the Common Era by figures such as Anthony of the Desert and Pachomius, emerged in part as a concrete attempt to obey that sentence. Monks entered narrow stone cells with interior dimensions, sometimes measuring less than 4 square meters, roughly the size of a modern parking space. They remained months without seeing another human being. They ate bread and dried dates, with meals that rarely exceeded 400 calories a day, a fraction of what a modern manual laborer consumes. They slept 3 to 4 hours a night on reed mats. And still they reported, in writings collected in the Sayings of the Desert Fathers, that intrusive thought kept arriving. Calculate the psychological toll. Calculate the weight of measuring yourself against a standard so high that even a solitary mind in the desert cannot fully attain it. And understand that the sentence Jesus pronounced was never intended to produce emotional torment. The theologians of the first millennium, reading the Sermon on the Mount as a whole, recognized something crucial. The purpose of the sentence was to expose human impossibility, not to construct a scale of merit. That Galilean hillside witnessed the moment when the moral measuring rod was repositioned to a place no human being could reach alone, and that was precisely the argumentative structure of the entire sermon. Follow the development. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 20, before the sentence about adultery, Jesus had already declared that unless the righteousness of his disciples exceeded that of the scribes and Pharisees, they would not enter the kingdom of heaven. He had announced a standard above the highest known religious standard in first-century Jewish culture. He then unfolded that standard across 6 examples, each following the formula you have heard that it was said, "But I tell you." The adultery example is the second of these 6, and each one deepens the interior demand. It was not enough to refrain from killing. You had to refuse to harbor anger. It was not enough to avoid physical adultery. You had to refuse to sustain deliberate desire. It was not enough to keep your oath. You had to be so truthful that the oath became unnecessary. The escalation was not moralistic, it was diagnostic. And there the real challenge began for those listening. If the righteousness required surpassed that of the Pharisees, and no one in the crowd was more scrupulous than the Pharisees, then no one in the crowd possessed sufficient righteousness. That conclusion was not announced aloud. It was left for each listener to arrive at alone, and many did. Later chronicles record that the impact of the Sermon on the Mount on the region of Galilee was so profound that entire communities reorganized their daily lives around those words. The text of Matthew chapter 7, verses 28 and 29, records the immediate reaction. The crowds were amazed at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority and not as their scribes. The scribes cited other rabbis. Jesus cited himself. And that authority, combined with the radical content of the sermon, left the listener in an uncomfortable position. Examine one more detail that slips past modern readers. The grammatical construction of verse 28 in Greek uses the verb blepo, meaning to look with intention, not simply to see. The distinction is decisive. In other places in the New Testament, the verb horao is used to describe involuntary visual perception. Here, blepo appears deliberately. It is not the image that enters the eye without permission. It is the gaze that returns, that lingers, that holds its focus like a fixed camera that chooses to remain pointed. The ancient translators of the Latin Vulgate in the 4th century chose the verb videre in the sense of to contemplate. The Syriac translators of the Peshitta, dated probably to the 2nd century, used an Aramaic term carrying the sense of to fix the gaze. In every case, the ancient tradition recognized that the word Jesus used did not condemn the involuntary instant. It condemned the sustained act of the will. And that nuance, lost in quick modern translations, is part of what caused the sentence to be so often interpreted as a general condemnation of human sexuality, which it was not. The records show something many people do not expect. Jesus, in other passages of the Gospels, demonstrated extraordinary respect and closeness toward women. In John chapter 4, he spoke publicly with a Samaritan woman, defying every religious and racial convention of the time. In Luke chapter 8, he permitted women to travel with his apostolic group, something without precedent among first-century rabbis. In John chapter 8, he defended a woman accused of adultery from the crowd intending to execute her. The sentence in Matthew 5 was not spoken by someone who saw women as a threat. It was spoken by someone who saw women as persons, and who therefore regarded any reduction of them to an object of desire as a violation of something sacred. Consider the broader moral landscape. In the ancient world, women were frequently treated as property, first of the father, then of the husband. The Jewish courts of the 1st century, drawing on the Mishnah, recorded cases in which adultery was judged primarily as a crime against the owning husband. Jesus repositioned the perspective. By locating sin in the desire of the one watching, he transferred responsibility from the woman being observed to the man who was looking. It was he who needed to govern himself, not she who needed to hide. And that inversion was socially revolutionary, on a scale comparable only to other great cultural shifts that would take more than 1,000 years to solidify into law. An obstacle then arises that many readers encounter. If the standard is that high, why keep trying? The answer in the following texts of the sermon indicates that the attempt does not rest on the pride of effort, but on the recognition of fragility. Whoever understands that they have failed the interior standard no longer measures themselves against a neighbor. They look at themselves with sobriety. And perhaps, from that gaze, they begin to look at others with something different from judgment. And now, after all of this, understand what that sentence actually was. It was not a decree designed to condemn humanity to the perpetual torment of self-examination. It was a demonstration that exterior morality, standing alone, is insufficient to describe what passes inside a person. It was a diagnosis before it was a demand. It was a mirror placed before each listener, not to destroy hope, but to point toward the need for something no human effort alone could produce. The subsequent texts of the Sermon on the Mount make this explicit. In Matthew chapter 6, Jesus moves on to speak about prayer, about dependence, about the impossibility of serving two masters at once. The logic is coherent. First, he raises the standard to an unreachable point. Then he points toward the only source capable of producing within the human being the transformation the standard requires. The Sermon on the Mount ended that afternoon. The crowd descended the hillside in silence. Some went back to their villages with light hearts, others with heavy ones. Fishermen returned to their nets. Women returned to their homes. Roman soldiers continued their rounds, and the Pharisees, according to the account, began planning how to confront this man who was rewriting the religious tradition of Israel from the inside out. 11 words in Greek, a sentence that appeared to be simply about looking and desire, and a permanent reconfiguration of how the West would come to understand ethics, conscience, intention, and personal responsibility. The philosophers of the Enlightenment, more than 1700 years later, would still be debating the concept of interior imputability, wrestling, often without knowing it, with that sermon on a morning in Galilee. Consider what this means when read alongside the rest of the Gospel accounts. The figure who spoke that sentence also declared in John chapter 8, verse 7, that only someone who had never sinned should cast the first stone. The internal consistency is precise. If no one reaches the interior standard, no one has the right to execute another person's exterior sin. The elevation of the standard and the mercy extended in the face of failure walk together in the same teaching from the same mouth. And it is in that balance that the sentence of Matthew 5 finds its full meaning. It was not made to crush, it was made to reveal, and in revealing, it opened space for something other than condemnation to enter. The documented history of that teaching's impact stretches across more than 2,000 years. It shaped legal codes, philosophical systems, psychological treatises, modern legal debates over intent and guilt, and even contemporary discussions about consent, dignity, and the gaze. The depth psychology of the 20th century, in writers such as Carl Gustav Jung, returned in scientific vocabulary to what that sentence had already pointed toward in religious vocabulary. Sustained thought constructs the person who acts. The prolonged gaze shapes the one who looks before it, affects the one who is seen. That morning in Galilee changed forever what it means to look at another human being and answer for what you do inside yourself.